The Future History of Energy and Transportation. Documenting the paradigm shift from the era of oil and internal combustion to the era of robotics. By Julian Cox. Narrated by the author with the aid of an artificial intelligence. Chapter 19. Of Carbon Tax. Author's note: here, in the humble opinion of this author, is why a revenue-neutral carbon tax, sufficient to move the needle of industry and consumer preference, would truly suck, in environmental terms. The following is a potentially counterintuitive explanation why advocating in favor of a carbon tax is likely to prove extremely counterproductive as a result of both inherent fallacy and highly predictable unintended consequences should such advocacy succeed. Scaling value-added taxation, VAT or sales tax, on fuels by some factor for well-to-X emissions is fine. It is ineffective at persuading choiceless consumers to change behavior significantly, as demonstrated in Europe and China, where upwards of 60% sales tax is applied to gasoline, but fine nonetheless. Crossing the philosophical boundary to basing taxation upon emissions directly, making the taxable event the point of emission rather than the point of sale, is a really very bad idea indeed. Here's why. When discussing a revenue-neutral carbon tax, we are not talking about taxing carbon in the form of diamonds and graphite and the balance of organic chemistry for medicine and industry. Instead, we are discussing carbon emissions from which there is no economic benefit received by society. No movement of people or luggage is accomplished uniquely by the production of emissions, and the emissions themselves are not an asset, any more than the exhaled breath of a person or an animal can reasonably be classed as an asset. It is true to say that in isolation from any side benefits, the sum of emissions in the atmosphere contributes to concern and to actual harm, including actual economic harm up to and including lowered quality of life, as well as measurable and significant costs to health. All else being equal, the world would definitively be a richer and nicer place to live without any vehicle or power generation emissions, all else being equal, meaning in the absence of added cost or other prohibitions on the services rendered by machines. One could argue that getting away with producing emissions is a subsidy, as indeed advocates for a carbon tax do. However, this does not appear to be a case of something that is counterintuitive but true, rather more simply, something that is not true. At least not without rewriting the economics of energy and transportation from the ground up, as well as its physics. If one were to be objectively fair in all cases, the sum of all energy in the wind, waves, tides, sunlight, the biomass of all trees and plants, and the function of scavenging animals, mold and bacteria, the production of oxygen by plants and algae, and the CO2 absorption and elimination capacity of the biosphere, all of it and more besides, like gravity or anything on Earth that serves a useful purpose. Anything that saves on the cost of living in a multi-trillion-dollar space station called Earth, could be labeled a subsidy and accorded an extraordinary value, but that would be arbitrary at best. Nobody has legitimate claim to ring-fence and charge for access to natural phenomena such as the waste disposal capacity of the atmosphere. Creating financial vehicles to speculate on human concern for the environment, real or imagined, is just as valid as financial vehicles to speculate on human appetite for oil in the ground, real or imagined, but there is something altogether amiss about the concept of taxation on the negative value of emissions. If the objective was sincerely to curtail public harm from emissions, the public should seek compensation from governments. Not compensate governments for every bit of public harm a government permits. Encouraging a government to charge money for emissions is to invite the worst and most unscrupulous pro-emissions behavior, since governments were encouraged to raise debt funding on Middle East oil. Charging money for nothing, or harm, has positive feedback loop issues. For example, if one wished to pay less income tax, the most simplistic means of doing that is to earn less income. Maybe one wanted more income, so commensurately one could be persuaded that more income tax was par for the course, especially if the government had done a good job of preparing the ground for a good income to be earned. This is an ordinary negative feedback loop. Conversely, if one wished to pay less carbon tax on the way to work, just choose a kind of car that operates tax-free. Tax problem solved, or is it? One still gets to work, but what about the government? What is the government going to do to balance its budget? There are essentially four choices before a government wishing to balance its books in the presence of a carbon tax. A. Raise an individual's income tax or a corporation's corporation tax to compensate for any act of opting out of the carbon tax. B. Tax the EV or other non-emitting tech to compensate for their lost emissions, for example by raising an EV-specific road tax. C. Keep raising the carbon tax on a diminishing pool of private and corporate emitters to compensate for others that opt out of paying the carbon tax. D. Corrupt the carbon tax legislation and/or implementation to provide exemptions for the most significant emitters. That's basically it. A and B are self-defeating. They are not just revenue neutral but entirely neutral. There is no net incentive for change. C is vortex economic chaos. D promotes and exacerbates emissions in a way that only a carbon tax could, and this option D, is in fact the realistic outcome of any revenue-neutral carbon tax, upon which all stakeholders with sufficient power to implement one would be willing to sign into law. Note: this is precisely what has occurred in Canada. There is currently a suggestion in the U.S. by the right-leaning Climate Leadership Council to link social welfare to a carbon tax, presumably calculated to guarantee left-wing riots ensue if emissions ever diminished, thereby causing the left-wing climate action lobby to set upon itself and implode. There is a truly fundamental economic divide between taxing the economic benefits received from fuels, and taxing the untaxed externality of economic harm from emissions. Truly fundamental, cannot be overstressed. Any entity, be it a person, a business or a government that routinely and forcibly demands money for nothing, or for something of negative value, is committing an act that is well defined in economic and ethical terms, extortion. This is different at its essence from taxing something of value, even to pay for something many or even most people would disagree with. It is also distinct at its essence from a fine, imposed under the criminal justice system for prosecuting a harmful criminal activity, like extortion. The properly constituted criminalization of an act must be intended either discreetly or as part of a system of escalating penalties to halt that criminal activity completely. Not to erect a system for a government to systematically profit from that activity, on an ongoing basis, post-criminalization. Otherwise one literally constructs a black market with all that a black market entails. Treating carbon emissions as a quasi-crime that is okay in return for paying an affordable fine, a carbon tax, is just such a black market. Nothing could possibly be more dangerous as a system of government than rewarding a government financially, in proportion to public harm and value destruction, such as paying the government via the tax code to allow harmful emissions. What incentive could there possibly be for good behavior on the part of such a government? Why would an elected official agree to invest public funds into removing revenue streams from its own carbon tax base? The correct answer with regards CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, for example, is that emissions are piped under pressure for enhanced oil recovery, to extend the life of stripper oil wells. That is the sort of thing a carbon tax regime official could agree to, because the total carbon to be taxed goes up. Nothing left to do but deceive the public about it with any tool of state propaganda available, up to and including classifying environmental misconduct as a state secret. Governments are a profit-motivated construct. Indistinguishable from a business except for the practically unchecked freedom to use financial and social coercion, as well as the threat and actual use of violence and incarceration. Neither a business nor a government will willingly go to work on extinguishing its own core sources of income. The closest one can hope for if the tax and backroom revenue streams do not align with societal good, is a grand pretense of good deeds. Any objective success would come only as a function of accident and incompetence. For example, a $7,500 Bush-era federal income tax incentive inadvertently propelling electrification forwards, instead of the bluff of fossil fuel-derived hydrogen aimed at thwarting it, on behalf of U.S. and Japanese auto industry and U.S. natural gas interests. It was supposed to be a significant tax on cigarettes and alcohol when compared with fruit and vegetables sounds very sensible. A government selling cigarettes and alcohol for vastly more profit than fruit and vegetables, not so much. Yet they describe exactly the same thing. The Swedish government has literally nationalized alcohol retail as a government monopoly, to raise tax revenues. Similarly, at the limit, a significant carbon tax is by degrees, a proxy for nationalizing the fossil fuel industry. Simply a case of diverting profits and revenues and finally the equity to a government. We have examples of carbon tax at the limit, where a government has monopolized all of the revenues and profits of their fossil fuel industrial base, and has captured all of the equity, Saudi Arabia and Iran. In Saudi and Iran, this approach has assuredly not proven to be a practical method of putting the fossil fuel industry out of business or encouraging its competition. Norway may seem like an exception to the rule, however Norway is simply leveraging its domestic hydroelectric assets to enable its nationalized oil industry to export more oil. Combining the fiscal budget interests of lawmakers with the revenue-generative interests of the fossil fuel industry, even more closely than is the case today, is clearly counterproductive to the ostensible purpose of a carbon tax to reduce emissions. Protectionist legislation, governments succumbing to lobbyists representing large entrenched interests, is the greatest of all barriers to the uptake of a new technology. Hence, closing the gap between lawmakers and emitters with a carbon tax is clearly not a good idea for those seeking the accelerated adoption of clean tech. Instead, the interests of global emissions reductions are served by deregulation, exposing monopolies to competition. Not by inviting incumbent emitters to outlaw tech disruption and to drown it in regulatory red tape and lawsuits. The argument for carbon tax is unconvincing when put to the test. There is already a proxy for heavy carbon taxation on road fuels in many nations around the world, including China, whose gasoline consumption has escalated dramatically, albeit with the all-important difference that fuel tax in China and elsewhere is a value-added input tax. Should this be extended to power utility fuels? Possibly, if the voters want that, and it would be reasonable for private companies supplying fuels of all kinds to settle their own tab for the military security of their private commercial infrastructure and supply lines, as distinct from national security. In many places there is already punitive taxation on automobile imports, and in some places such as Norway there is a hard distinction on the kind of car to which punitive taxation applies. It does not currently apply to electric vehicles. Norway is an oil exporter. That is the mainstay of its economy. It is both the domain of a nationalized oil industry and a nation with a 98% hydroelectric power grid. Reviewing an April 2016 interview with the Norwegian Minister for Energy and Transport and Elon Musk of Tesla, the minister praised Tesla's accomplishments in seeking to compete with oil derivatives and internal combustion in energy and transportation, with a better product at a competitive price instead of seeking for governments to limit or ban the competition. The minister then asked when electric vehicles will be able to compete without differential taxation and incentives in Norway and on the European continent as a whole. A treatise on carbon tax and the IMF multi-trillion-dollar unpriced externality of emissions was clearly not the answer he was looking for. Norway has already levied approximately 100% taxation on competition to electric vehicles, both internal combustion cars and their fuels. In any event, Norway is slated to ban new sales of internal combustion engine vehicles from 2025, literally banning the competition, which is a far more sensible idea than a carbon tax, and completely incompatible with one. A list of national bans in prospect on the sale of internal combustion vehicles shows a spread of 2021 to 2040. It is arguably a lapse of consumer protection to permit the unrestricted sale of cars with engines from 2025, not on account of emissions but because somewhere in that timeframe there is a predictable cascade collapse of resale values of such vehicles, with knock-on issues for delinquent vehicle finance and a high potential for the collapse of OEM warranty service provisions. Something that no consumer would agree to accept was fair exposure to risk upon shaking a car dealer's hand. From a national perspective, a carbon tax, even without the predictable unintended consequences discussed herein, is superfluous. There is a far more compelling economic rationale for maintaining differentially attractive market conditions for electric vehicles than a focus on emissions could ever justify. Both in an oil-producing nation like Norway and in every net customer nation also, balance of trade and energy independence. The accelerated adoption of electric vehicles is a fast track to an improved national economy, strategic energy independence and reduced public health costs. It's worth it on its merits without going anywhere near the subject of taxing the negative value of emissions. When going through the ABCD, above, of possible outcomes of implementing a revenue-neutral carbon emissions tax. Option D, corrupting the tax code to provide benefits to emitters, by far the gravest unintended consequence is implicit. An overwhelming incentive for tax avoidance. A carbon tax is not a tax on fuel, it's a tax on getting caught generating emissions. This is difficult to evade for consumers but an ultimate source of empowerment for institutionalized corruption in industry and collaboration with the highest levels of government. On the macro scale, it is a tax on emissions, inspected in accordance with an established protocol for inspection. There is absolutely no limit to how far the line of that protocol can be blurred and shifted under the influence of lobbyists, nor how far that line can be obfuscated for public consumption. At the outermost limit of deception, it can be argued that processing methane to CO2 is an environmental benefit by lowering the GHG potency of methane. All you have to do is set the false premise that the CH4 will eventually escape to the surface, or fail to prove in court that it won't. The final result that all could compromise on is the same compromise that has been reached in the past, and that is this: penalize the exhaust pipe. There is no need to guess how this plays out in reality. CARB in California and the Zero Emissions Vehicle, ZEV, credit systems throughout many states in the USA assesses emissions at the tailpipe of cars. This leaves the door wide open to hydrogen, thanks to aggressive lobbying efforts of emitters. Hydrogen from natural gas creates emissions in truly prodigious quantities of up to 16.58 kilograms of CO2 for every 1 kilogram of compressed hydrogen fuel, with the same energy content as 1 US gallon of gasoline, or 46.7% more carbon intensive per unit of energy well to wheel. All of the emissions of hydrogen are upstream of the tailpipe instead of 25% for gasoline, and hence hydrogen emissions are immune to assessment by CARB. Hydrogen fuel cell lobbyists comprising fracking operators, including the traditional oil majors, industrial gas majors, the traditional internal combustion engine industry, typically led by Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, but also GM and others, have led a taxpayer-funded assault upon wind, solar, hydro, wave, nuclear, and anything else that is genuinely carbon emissions-free. This is the utterly cynical and yet the discreetly rational underpinning of a multi-billion-dollar pursuit by very smart people of a self-evidently hopeless technology. This is the why of hydrogen. The hydrogen economy, which means gas drilling, fracking and SMR, steam methane reforming, of shale methane and methane hydrates to produce hydrogen via the fossil fuel industry's most carbon-intensive process. For emission intensity, it can't be beat. 16.58 kilograms CO2e per kilogram of hydrogen with the same total energy as 1 US gallon of gasoline, compares to gasoline emissions of 11.3 kilograms between extraction and consumption by the same metrics, both figures supplied by a leading hydrogen advocate, Dr. C.E. Sandy Thomas, an affiliate of Toyota's hydrogen program. By mass, hydrogen is even worse. 50 million metric tons of hydrogen production in 2013, almost entirely methane-derived. 95% of U.S. production is derived this way, with some contributions from heavier liquid hydrocarbons from butane upwards, as well as the gasification of coal. 50 million metric tons of hydrogen was 1.1% as a percentage by mass of 2013 crude oil extraction, totaling 4.2 gigatons, and yet this 1.1% of the fossil fuel industry by mass was responsible for 10% of total vehicle emissions, or 829 million metric tons of CO2. Hydrogen production accounted for at least 3% of all man-made carbon emissions that year from all activities from cement and hydrocracking for transport fuels to heat, light and industry. Hydrogen is unquestionably the very last industry on Earth one would wish to promote in the name of GHG emissions reductions, and this is exactly what is promoted by CARB and what is funded disproportionately by the Californian taxpayer and promoted to U.S. citizens as a cornerstone of attempts to tackle climate change. If the logic of how we got from carbon tax-like initiatives to an unholy incentive to pollute is tiresome and difficult to follow, then this is precisely why a carbon tax is so dangerous to a public who is willing to vote for their government to take action that will result in the exact opposite, actual emissions reductions in the real world. This is but a mild preview of the unintended consequences of a sweeping carbon tax, spurring on the dredging and drilling of undersea methane hydrates, otherwise known as clathrate formations, funded and promoted by the taxpayer in the name of green energy. Methane hydrates are the natural resource that Toyota promotes as a little footnote alongside sweeping hyperbole concerning the elemental hydrogen content of water, plants and biomass, and the potential to produce hydrogen with solar and wind energy. The fuel for the next 100 years. Really? If climate science is 97% correct, this threatens to end humanity within 50 with a 97% probability. Again, when going through the ABCD, above, of possible outcomes of implementing a revenue-neutral carbon emissions tax, option C would appear to be the main attraction for sophisticated advocates. An opt-out for non-emitting technologies, resulting in a vortex escalation of carbon taxation on the remaining emitters. A and B being pointless and D being the main attraction for the emitters themselves. What option C represents is a positive feedback loop, but at its base this concept contains a false premise, which is to say that renewables and electric vehicles are uncompetitive, unless the competition becomes artificially more expensive. Actually it contains two. At this juncture, renewables and production capacity for electric vehicles require capital for manufacturing infrastructure more than they require additional profit advantage. There is a far more interesting way to use the tax code to move capital than to tax carbon. That is to focus on dividend stocks and growth stocks and to moderate or eliminate capital gains tax on the transfer of wealth from one to the other, in so doing clearing a singular source of economic and political entrenchment, the government standing in the way of divestment from stagnant fossil fuel dividend stocks. Similarly, new growth industries that need to purchase plant, machinery and energy generative infrastructure will benefit greatly from rapid expensing, compressed depreciation, in the tax code. Such an initiative is planned in the U.S. Update, it's implemented. Update 2. It is threatened again, in the name of environmental policy. Finally, the big reason why a carbon tax is unnecessary. The economic mechanism at the heart of the Internet of Things, IoT, in energy and transportation, of which EV, battery and solar roof maker Tesla is the key exemplar. The ability to sweep the market with one decision, the decision to implement a legitimate positive feedback loop. That is this, customer, provider profit sharing of autonomous EV ride-hailing services. Update, between first writing this and publication, Tesla has in fact announced that precisely this service will be forthcoming with its autonomous vehicles. The Tesla Network. This system entails widely distributed vehicle ownership and a Tesla central network operations hub, supporting hailing, billing and profit sharing between Tesla and its customers who own its fleet. Proceeds of transportation services rendered are divided between the asset owner, the customer, and the service provider, Tesla. This flips the concept of vehicle purchase as a depreciating cost item to an income and profit-generating asset. This is a vehicle sale that elevates the consumer to the status of a retailer of transportation. Whether a private customer owns a car or two, a car dealership wishes to allocate capital from the lot to a fleet, perhaps a village, municipality, city or a major fleet owner, the more Tesla electric autonomous vehicles the customer buys, the richer they get, hence the positive feedback loop. In this way the customer is motivated to advance capital to Tesla for vehicle production, which in combination with network service revenues, funds exponential acceleration of production capacity. Unlike the fossil fuel vortex dump contemplated for a carbon tax, option C above, it does not signify extortion, charging money for a null or negative value proposition, nor does it risk an option D to be exploited by emitters. Neither is it a black market that holds the potential to set a government against its own people, which has happened in California with the state government actively competing with taxpayers' dollars on behalf of the hydrogen lobby against its own largest auto employer, Tesla, with zero hope of the taxpayer gaining any return on investment, be that financial or environmental. The most likely outcome in the final analysis, $500 million of taxpayer-funded hydrogen filling stations without any customers. Sufficient public funds wasted to have replaced 2 utility-scale power stations entirely with solar and delivered 2,000 megawatt-hours of grid storage batteries had anyone actually thought to prioritize the emissions reductions promised to Californian taxpayers, with their money. Update, Tesla moved its corporate headquarters to Texas. Bottom line, taxation must denote a public-private partnership aimed at advancing societal gain. One does not simply reward a government via the tax code for societal harm and expect a good outcome.